demonstrate some kind of psychokinetic effect. But parapsychological researchers who've actually done the work are also convinced that there is what they call macro PK, or macro psychokinesis, in which certain talented people can, for example, levitate tables, make them rise up in the air. Some very responsible researchers are convinced that this happens. There's all the kinds of phenomena that involve materializations that used to happen a great deal in the 1890s, but don't happen so much now for some reason. But they're very well documented, and there are current cases of this time. So there's a lot of evidence that whatever it is that we are, we have this ability to affect the physical world in meaningful ways that are not mediated through the body. And the outer limit of this ability is not known at the current time. We're not quite sure. Okay? So this series of lectures begins with the assumption, first of all, that the personality, the conscious, thinking, feeling personality, is not an epiphenomena of the body. That consciousness is not dependent on the brain. This is a premise. I'm not going to argue that. I'm just going to take that as a premise for the purpose of our talks this weekend. That the personality is something other than the brain and the body. And that the personality, me and you, the person who is listening to me, and I who am speaking, that we are causal agencies. That the decisions that we make and the intentions that we form and the wishes that we harbor affect the world around us, both through our bodies and in other ways, the limits of which are very difficult to define. Right? And finally, that the personality can exist without the support of the body. That when we die, when our bodies become dysfunctional, our personalities, the part of us that we remember, the part of us that we call by our own name, that entity continues after the death of the body and enjoys some kind of further extension of the life cycle, probably, as we'll see, in other worlds that we'll be talking about. So all of this is a lot, and yet all of this is entailed in the idea of reincarnation and the survival of bodily death. This is what Frederick Myers realized 100 years ago as he put together his great book on human personality and its survival of bodily death. That there are a tremendous number of factors of our experience which should lead us to believe that the human personality transcends its body. And many of these evidences for the transcendence of the body come from what we now call parapsychology. And that all of this supports the idea that we are independent of our physical body and that we survive it when it dies. Right, so this is the body of data that I want to discuss. These are the assumptions with which we begin this weekend. There's a lot of other places where people have argued for this, and I'm not going to do that this weekend. I'm just going to start with that as an assumption. And then the question is, how do we make sense of that? What does it mean if that's true? How can we understand the fact that it's true? This is the place that we are in our work at Esalen. We're in the process of trying to form a theory. And I've been putting together this comprehensive metaphysical system based on the work primarily of Alfred North Whitehead and Sri Aurobindo. And all of us have begun to think that this theory I'm putting together may be a very good starting point in forming the explanations that we need. I'm not offering a solution. I'm offering a gesture in the direction of a solution. I'm offering a perspective which I think can lead us to the solution of these problems. But there's a lot more work to be done. And what I want to do this weekend is two things. I first of all want to establish the initial plausibility of this perspective. I want to bring out a new way of speaking about what's real that is consistent with common sense, that's consistent with modern and postmodern science, that's consistent with parapsychology, and that's consistent with reincarnation and the survival of bodily death. I want to present a language in which we can speak about all those phenomena and make sense of them in describing a world in which, first of all, physicists will get just the results that they do get, and secondly, in which the horizons for human existence are much broader than they are if we take the work of the scientists too narrowly and too literally. I want to create a new context in which to understand both science and current science and parapsychology. And then in the last lecture, the fifth lecture, I want to consider, having described this new universe of meaning, I want to ask, how does science have to expand itself to be able to operate in the broader universe that I hope to make intelligible? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, why is it that it is so difficult for us to deal with this issue? Why is it that this issue, which is of such overwhelming existential import, does not have a department devoted to it in any university in the world? It's very odd. Right? So, I don't have a full answer to that question, but it's one I'd like you to sort of feel. But one reason is because the impact of these ideas could be so huge. But another is that just the very notion of parapsychology, for example, the very notion of parapsychology subverts the distinction between subject and object. It's not quite clear who causes what in parapsychology. And the idea of reincarnation and life after death subverts the distinction between life and death. People don't like it when the dichotomies in terms of which they organize their experience and their societies are subverted in any way. This is one reason that gays are so unpopular, right? Because gays subvert the distinction between male and female and make people uncomfortable. Right? So in broaching this subject, we're doing something that in a certain way is taboo. People don't talk about death. People don't talk about ghosts. They get creeped out when we talk about ghosts or dead people, communicating with dead people. There's something almost obscene about it. Right? So we're dealing in this odd territory. And often, out in this odd territory, there are odd people and odd things happen. Right? The trickster. This guy George Hansen wrote a wonderful book called The Trickster and the Paranormal. And one of the points he's making is that when we get out into this territory, the paranoid territory, out beyond conventional definitions, we're in this kind of no man's land. And there are these strange, tricksterish people and energies that operate in the no man's land outside of our metaphysical comfort zone. Now, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to go out into this territory, this trickster zone, this place outside of the metaphysical comfort zone, but I don't want to be a trickster. Instead, I want to say that there's a new metaphysical system, a new set of categories in terms of which we can assimilate this data. We can assimilate this vastly expanded vision of human potential and still be making sense to ourselves and each other. That's the objective. That's what I want to try to present. Now, that's one reason it's difficult, is because it requires a metaphysical leap and it's scary. But the second reason is that in a more mundane way, the idea of reincarnation and of personality survival and of parapsychological effects contradicts the basic ideas that we were taught as we were given a modern education. Right? We learned certain fundamental ideas about the nature of reality, which make it difficult for us to even conceptualize the possibility of life after death. So I want to go over some of those ideas and see if you can sort of feel them with me. So first of all, we've been taught that reality is outside of experience. And reality is out there. Right? So what we see is we see tables and chairs and people, right? And that's all our interpretation. But out there, beyond our experience, there are atoms and probability fields and energetic movements of some kind that we can't actually experience. Because everything we experience is already subjective. But objective reality is out there, somehow alien from us, or different in nature from what we are. And so once you start thinking that, it starts to seem like we aren't even real. And I'm endlessly fascinated by some scientist who wrote a book called The User Illusion. It's like a 700-page book in which he tried to prove that there is no consciousness, and that consciousness is actually just the illusion created by the operation of the body in some way, right? So this is the kind of ideas that we have in modernity. It's like, who was he writing that book for, is the question I always want to ask. Okay, so this idea that reality is outside of experience and that consciousness is somehow a byproduct or an epiphenomena of the real stuff out there not only makes it hard to understand reincarnation, it makes it hard to understand consciousness itself. How can we even have a personality or know anything about the world if all we are is dead matter? So that's a big problem. But another idea we have from our modern education is that what is real? What is out there? Underlie that stuff out there, right? That's what all process is about. Everything that happens is somehow a functioning of that stuff that's out there. So, for example, if we go back to Newton, he says, reality consists of infinitely small BBs moving around in a three-dimensional space. That's it. And everything we see is somehow a combination of those BBs somehow forming into various configurations. We're all taught something like that in grammar school, right? That's sort of what's going on. And so we have the idea that what is out there is formed already. Like the atoms are already little tiny spheres, and they already have gravitational fields. So the form and the matter go together. And all the form that anything is ever going to have is already contained in the forms of those things that are out there. Like the atoms already have in them the potential for everything, for the suns, right? For the planets, for life, for evolution. It's all there in the atoms because they're the only things that are really formed. And when we think about it this way, those entities out there are not in time the same way we are. Like we live temporally. And Kant spoke about, consciousness in terms of time and matter in terms of space, consciousness in terms of time and matter in terms of space, because to be conscious, to be aware, to function, is to be moving in time, right? Is to be expressing temporality. There is no consciousness without process, which is happenings in time. But when we think about atoms, they aren't happening in time, because atoms are supposed to be exactly identical, even at an instant. There's no process involved. For Newton, for example, there's no process involved in the existence of an atom. It just is. It's outside of time. But we are in time, right? Which inspired Kant to suggest that time is somehow subjective, right? Whereas the noumenal reality, the reality out there, may not be. So we're taught that actual stuff, real matter, isn't involved in process. It's already always what it is. It doesn't happen, it just is.